Welcome to part two of the multi-part caregiver video series, specifically focused on advanced caregiving and supporting your loved one who's struggling with mental health issues, behavioral issues, substance misuse issues, many issues. My name is Natasha Viles, and I will be leading you through this series. And today's focus will be a continuation of parent blocks, as well as an introduction to emotions and emotion basics. I recommend that you watch these videos in order as they do build upon themselves. And the last video was a focus on just the introduction of your role, the power of your role, as well as the impact of mental health issues on families. As well as we talked a bit about animal models, and you had the homework of taking the animal models and reviewing them and sharing them with your loved one, as well as with a partner, co-parent, and other people who are offering caregiving to your loved one. We're also going to have some homework today, focusing on something called parenting dimensions, and I'll get to that at the end of this video. But I do want to continue on with the caregiver blocks as an introduction to what we're going to be doing today. So as I mentioned, we talked about the animal models, but I wanted to talk about another way of conceptualizing and working through blocks. As I've been talking about, quite often our behavior can be fueled by fear, but there are also other emotions that can underlie some of the emotional blocks that come up. Shame, self-blame, hopelessness, helplessness, and even resentment are usual suspects. So remember, these emotions are emotions that aren't just fleeting, they're emotions that come up, that get stuck, that have thoughts associated, attitudes, behaviors associated with, and can actually fuel the way that we interact with our loved ones. These emotions can be triggered by mental health issues, and they can also be influenced by your own emotional history. So we absolutely can't pretend like our own experience with emotions doesn't then trickle into our relationship with our loved one. I want you to take a moment and look at this tree. This tree is a great example of how different behaviors can be fueled by emotions and emotional states. So up top are the behaviors of denial, avoidance, criticism, rejection, maybe accommodating behaviors, enabling behaviors, blaming, or defensiveness. You would be a superhero, not of this world, if you didn't ever have any of these experiences when interacting with your loved one, because as humans, we absolutely can get evoked and react in different ways, especially when there is unprocessed emotion beneath the surface. So if you look at all of these behaviors above ground, if you see these in yourself or anyone else, your loved one, anyone else who's involved in the process or you're interacting with, you can know for sure that there are roots of emotion and emotional states underground, whether that's fear, grief, shame, self-blame, hopelessness, resentment, helplessness. All of these emotions make sense for different reasons, different experiences. And it's important to note that any of those behaviors above ground are fueled by emotion, not just because the person's trying to be manipulative or because they are intentionally trying to harm you or disconnect, or their motivation is low, but rather because there are some emotions beneath the surface, and that's what's actually fueling the behavior. I wanted to talk a little bit about resentment. I've noticed in my work over the years with clinicians and with caregivers, and if you also look at the research behind emotion, there's kind of a general thing that can happen. So if you find yourself stuck in resentment and it feels like it's not going away, I'm really curious if these three things are present for you. So as I read through them, just check yourself and notice if they actually fit for your experience. So if you're noticing that as you're offering your loved one support through this process, you're actually finding a high level of resentment towards them for the amount of effort that you're putting in, or for how they're not responding to what you're offering, or how they are responding, you may have experienced these following things. Perhaps when you were growing up, you didn't get what you needed from your parents, at least emotionally. You wouldn't have even dreamed of thinking about or asking for what you're currently offering to your child, because you're giving them so much above and beyond. Despite not getting what you needed, you survived and thrived to be able to give your loved one the life that they have today. And perhaps you have siblings that didn't survive as well. And then at the end of it all, you fought so hard to give your loved one a better life than you could have dreamed of. And you did give them a better life. And yet they're still struggling, and they may even be blaming you or having their own resentment or toxicity towards you. And so it would make sense if you'd have these feelings of resentment coming up, because it's like, wait a minute, When I was younger, I wouldn't have dreamed of asking for the life that I'm giving you. And I fought to overcome despite not getting what I'm currently offering you. And now I'm giving you the care and the resources that I believe are like above par. And yet you're still struggling and you're still having a hard time getting out of this. You're maybe not launching, you're blaming me. And so the resentment is actually fueled by anger and hurt. Anger towards, wait a minute, why didn't I get that? And hurt about that piece, but then also possible self blame or shame. Like, what's wrong with me because I am doing so much and I'm offering my child more than I ever dreamed of, and I turned out okay. So, what is it about our relationship that makes it so that my loved one isn't okay? Now, this may not be the case for you, but if it is the case for you, I just want to say that this is something that can absolutely happen when you have fought so hard to give your loved one more. And yet it still feels like, despite all of the effort that you're putting in, more effort than you even thought was humanly possible, they're not okay. Or maybe they're seeming unmotivated or like they're not changing. And so it can be a really frustrating place to be in. I also want to reassure you that as we're going through this caregiver series, I'm not asking you to do more. If you already feel like you're at the end of your rope because you've given so much, I would love to support you to be able to see how you can be more efficient with the energy you are giving and conserve energy so that you don't burn out. And also get underneath those dynamics to try and help shift a little bit the reactions from your loved one, which can actually happen through how you offer them support. So I want to talk about what could be feeding your animal. We talked about the animal models in video number 1, and I talked about some of the fears that can come up. And I wanted to just give you a few examples because sometimes it's helpful. We don't even know why we're scared. It's hard to label it. And remember, we got to label it to tame it, name it to tame it. So I want to give you a few examples as to why you might be feeling a little bit blocked. See if any of these fit for you. Notice what happens inside as I read through them. She will reject me and I can't bear to lose her. I don't feel capable of taking this on and I will no doubt make it worse. I'm afraid I will break down, explode in anger, or do or say something I will regret. If I face his pain, it will be proof that my worst fear will have come true. I broke him. I will not. I will be to blame. Others will blame me. I can't afford to put strain on my couple relationship or alienate the other children, family members who need me. I'm afraid this will cause him too much suffering. I'm afraid of babying her and preventing her from becoming independent or encouraging her eternal dependence on me. Resentment. She's done enough damage to our family. How long must this go on? And I'm terrified of pushing her or him too far and leading him to depression or worse, suicide. So I encourage you to take a moment and notice which ones fit for you, as well as you may have some other stories from that voice in your head that's telling you, oh, and this could happen and this could happen if you make changes, if you step in, if you set limits, if you offer emotional support, if you go there. It can be so powerful to understand what the voice is saying in our head, because then we'll actually know how to work through it. Now, remember, there may be some wisdom connected to these beliefs, and so it would make sense that there'd be a part of you that would want to stop in your tracks. But let's learn how to harness the wisdom and answer the question, how can I move forward, instead of if I move forward. The phenomenon it blocks is present in day-to-day caregiving, whether or not your loved one has mental health issues. And so it can be so powerful just to know your tendencies, especially as you're supporting your loved one to engage in recovery, because it can help shift up the dynamic that's happening. If you're able to change your regular patterns, it can actually affect change in your loved one, because one action leads to a reaction. And so it's essentially like if you're both in a duel, I remember Gabor Mate saying one time, if you're both in a duel, someone needs to disarm so that then the energy of the dynamic can shift. And so it can be really powerful to understand where you're coming from and how you're kind of entered into that dynamic in order to shift back and allow the entire dynamic or mobile to shift. Some caregivers are more sensitive to rejection. So you may notice that you don't care so much if your loved one uses choice language with you, but you do care if they say, like, I don't want to see you anymore, or they actually just walk out of the room when you're arguing. Some caregivers are more comfortable with comforting their loved one when sad, versus setting limits. Whereas other caregivers might be more comfortable setting limits, but then as soon as that sadness comes out, it feels really vulnerable to go there and like the last place you want to go. There's no right answer and there's no one size fits all. And so it's important just to know kind of where you are. And one of the tools that we use, and it's actually one of my favorite tools in EFFT, is called the Parenting Dimensions tool or the Relationship Dimensions tool. So you will see that I actually pasted it beneath this video for you to be able to access it and go through and use for homework at the end of this video. So the reason why we use the Dimensions tool is to help target extremes so that you can reflect on your defaults. See the ways that you're reacting and interacting with your loved one in those extreme cases in order to change them up. We can't necessarily say what's going to happen, but what I do know is that if you change the regular patterns, it will affect change in your child because every action has a reaction. So some caregivers are better able to do rejection versus disrespect. And we've talked about comfortable setting limits or offering comfort. And so see where you are on the spectrum, and then you'll have more of a clue of where you need to go. So this is just a few of them. As noted, it is posted beneath this video, but just to go through it, you may find that you're always apologizing. So you're way over here on the extreme, whereas other times you may find that you never apologize. And so be curious about what it is that you're doing. Maybe you always express anger. Maybe you never express anger. Maybe you're always crying when your loved one struggles. Maybe you never cry. Down here, maybe you never criticize. You're so worried about harming them if you criticize. And then maybe on the other end of the spectrum, you're always criticizing. Never shouting, always saying I love you, never saying I love you. A lot of people ask, like, well, why would you want to change the extreme? For example, if I'm always saying I love you, what's wrong with that? Possibly nothing. This is the piece where I really can't tell you what is right or what is wrong. But what I do know is that if you're in the extreme, it could be more than just a habit, and it may actually be connected to fears, shame, self-blame, hopelessness, helplessness, resentment. One of the ways that I see always saying I love you come out is that the caregiver may be worried that the individual doesn't feel their love. And so they're always saying, I love you, but it's actually more of like a check-in, like, I love you, I love you, I love you, in fear of the child not being okay. But it's not actually offering love. It's more of like a, tell me that you're okay. Tell me that you understand it. Or it might also be like, I need you to reassure me that you're still connecting with me. So I'm going to say I love you so that you say I love you back so that I can settle. So it may not be the case, but one way to find out if it actually is helping you meet another need is to not do it for 24 hours. Can be so curious. You know, they say if you want to find out why you do something, stop doing it for 24 hours and then you'll really learn why you do it. I know that when I fill out the dimensions in my own parenting and in my relationships, I absolutely gain so much insight because I realize that, okay, actually this is more to meet my need, or that this is to avoid something worse from happening in the story of my mind. So something that I struggled with and I have to check myself with often is closeness. I would much rather promote closeness than distance. Just if I look at my own upbringing and experience of relationships, I have this deep fear and belief that my daughter won't feel like I'm there for her and present with her. And so I'm more likely to be so close with her that I smother her. And I'm always there with her and I'm always hyper attuned to her and I'm always encouraging comfort and connection and closeness, which actually doesn't give her any space to breathe and doesn't give her any space to make sense of things for herself because I'm always there over her shoulder. So I've had to learn how to notice when I am connecting to her for her and notice when I'm connecting to her for myself, whether it's to soothe myself from being in her presence and seeing that she's okay and calming those fears, or to make sure that she knows that I love her, but that's more of my own fears. So it can be so curious to see why you're doing what you're doing just by not doing it. So when I was working through promoting closeness, I stopped like always attuning to her all the time. And I noticed my own anxiety coming up, which was then I connected it to those different fears and whatever else I had inside. Similarly, if you find that you never set limits versus always setting limits too easily, be curious about that. See what happens when you set a limit. Quite often, setting limits and not setting limits is connected to your comfort around validating and being present with your loved one's anger. So if you have a fear of how your loved one is going to react or explode, you are going to likely be more likely to not set limits in order to avoid having to deal with that situation. Another one that I hear about a lot, especially with families who've been in this process for a long time, is that maybe they never use humor anymore. It's always serious. And so it feels like using humor would be almost too light for the situation at hand, given the fact that their loved one is struggling with a chronic mental health issue. Yet what happens is that we can end up walking on eggshells and feeling like we have to be serious all the time. And humor and laughter and joy can actually be an antidote to depression and disconnect. And so it's amazing how when you can bring in some more of that lightness, you can sometimes bring more energy and joy into the family. But quite often there is a fear that if that's brought in, it will kind of unacknowledge what's going on currently for your loved one. On the other side of things, you may find that you're using humor all the time. And so maybe it's more of an ostrich approach where you feel like if you just use humor, everything will okay. You don't have to really acknowledge what's going on deep down. And that might be because maybe you're uncomfortable with vulnerability. And so it's easier to just use humor. So what I'm going to ask you to do is actually go through, so print off and go through the dimensions at the end of this video and mark yourself on the scale. So just put a little dot wherever you locate yourself on the scale and be curious about which ones are the most extreme. I'm going to give you a clue. None of us are down the middle all the time. And it's actually not helpful to be down the middle all the time because we want to have a little bit of variability in the way that we are, and that's what makes our personality. But the other piece is that if we have those extremes, it is likely a clue that there's something else going on underneath. So go through your extremes. I'll talk more about it in the homework afterwards of how you can use it, but I encourage you to use this tool to help you see where you can start in terms of shifting up some of those patterns between you and your loved one. I talked a little bit about how you're either going to struggle more with soothing or setting limits, but we actually need to find a balance of both. So just to give you an idea, the treatment for softer parents is to give them books on discipline. The treatment of firmer parents is to give them books on emotions. The trick is that they never seem to want the other kind of book. So if you're someone who's really comfortable with offering soothing, you're likely going to not really like that I say you need to set limits more, or you might find reasons why it doesn't fit for your family. Similarly, if you find that you're someone who's always setting limits and you have a bit of discomfort around soothing or offering support in those moments that need comfort, like sadness, you may find reasons why you're not the person to do that, or why that's too uncomfortable, or it doesn't really fit for your situation. What I will tell you is that in order to recover from a mental health issue, individuals need support to be able to tolerate limits that are set around them, but they also need comfort in those moments of sadness. And so it's actually a balance of both. So let this be a clue for you. As you hear me talk about this, which one are you more comfortable with? And that is amazing. That's a starting point. Which one are you less comfortable with? Also amazing in the starting point, because then that's your clue of where you can take one little step forward, change it by 1 degree, put down 1 brick in order to see if you can't shift some of the ways that you're interacting with your loved one to help them increase their self-efficacy with emotion. So I mentioned last video about the idea of motivation and how it's actually more about being afraid and low self-efficacy with emotion. So it's important to note that you yourself might be feeling a little unmotivated in the process, but I would actually challenge that it's probably more likely connected to fear and your own self-blame or exhaustion or any other variation. And so just know that it makes sense if you're struggling to support your loved one, because you may actually be more motivated to avoid something worse from happening, like those animals that we talked about. What your fear is, what's feeding your animal. And so it would make a lot of sense if there's part of you that doesn't want to do certain things, because if you peel back the surface and look underneath, likely there's a part of you that's so worried about something worse from happening, as discussed in the previous slide about what's feeding your animal, that it's easier to stay stuck than to risk that happening. So we can offer you skills training for this, as well as ideas on how to conceptualize and things to work through so that you can work through your fear and self-blame. And I'll talk at the end of the series about what you might want to do to reach out for more support so that you aren't stuck in that place. Because sometimes we have emotion blocks, and when we're so deep in them, we actually need someone from the outside to help us process them, because we can't do it for ourselves. Breathing. I talked about this last week. I'm a little bit obsessed with breathing, if anyone knows me. And I want to talk about it because it's amazing how the breath can actually be a superpower. I'm pretty obsessed with it to the point where my toddler will say to me, take a breath, take a breath. And so it's become a bit of a norm in the home, but it's because it's amazing how we can help settle our nervous system, settle some of those scattered thoughts, and connect to wisdom and groundedness in just 2 minutes. So I told you how to do it last week, but I want to show you how to do it right now. And I'm going to invite you to breathe along with me. So as you're breathing, notice what's happening inside your body. Notice what's happening in terms of stress. Notice what's happening in terms of your thoughts, and just start to really focus on the breath. So take a breath in through your nose to about 80% full. And out through your mouth to about 110% exhale. The trick for this is that you want to actually hear yourself exhaling, because you can really get that air out, which really helps to settle the nervous system, bring regulation, and clears your mind. So if you have any situations where you're feeling like you don't know the answer, or you're feeling a little bit confused, rather than talking it out with anyone, I'd recommend that you spend some time going to your breath, set a 2-minute alarm, and just breathe for 2 minutes. Because what can happen is that we quite often can have wisdom inside of us, but the minute that we get anxious or have any of those emotions that really evoke us, we kind of get a little bit frazzled. And the more frazzled we are, the less capable we are of being able to connect to the wisdom inside. So breathing can really help us put our feet on the ground and be able to access our intuition. So we talked a little bit about how to be aware and process those parent blocks with the animal models, with the dimensions tool, and now with breathing, as well as being aware of what's feeding your animal. Now I want to start the process of talking about emotion coaching. I won't go through the actual steps of emotion coaching in this video, but I will talk about emotion basics, how to process them, and how to enter into putting yourself in your loved one's shoes. So why do we want to support you to become an emotion coach? Well, the first thing is that it actually can help you manage anything that's coming your way with your loved one. So we actually ask caregivers to increase your role as your loved one's emotion coach to support the processing of emotion and facilitate symptom interruption. You do not have to have a master's degree for this. I learned this after my master's degree at the same time as observing a caregiver workshop, and then of course seeking further training to become a trainer. But what I can tell you is that I have worked with hundreds of parents, and the majority of them are not therapists or work in any kind of helping profession, psychologically minded, and they absolutely can learn this. And so you can too. It doesn't matter where you are. You can learn how to take one step beyond where you are to help support the processing of your loved one's emotions as well as symptom interruption. So this is part 2 of advanced caregiving. So notice what's happening inside and notice what you want to say when I put this example up on the screen. And then I'll give you a few of the common examples that we hear. Your child comes home to you and says, Mom, Dad, I'm a loser at school. Maybe we'll tag on, and nobody likes me. Mom, Dad, I'm a loser at school. Nobody likes me. What is your first impulse? What do you want to say? Quite often the responses are, that's not true. I think you're great. What did you do? Maybe the kids are just jealous, or any variation of the above. If we notice what's behind all of those responses, do those responses take the individual deeper into their pain or yoink them out of it to try and make them disbelieve it? Yoink them out of it to try and make them disbelieve it. And this is normal. I can promise you that when I do this in clinician trainings or in caregiver workshops, across the board, it's mostly similar answers because we want to free our loved ones from their pain and we don't want to see them stuck in it. So we do whatever we can to try and help rescue them from it. There are other reasons as well that we're going to go through why we would answer in that way. So I think we can all agree that essentially those responses in general, and you may have had a few different, but just in general, that they actually make us avoid our loved ones' feelings. And this is not abnormal, but I want to help you understand why as a society we actually avoid our loved ones' feelings. The first one that I mentioned a bit ago was that we actually want to free them from emotional pain. Your loved one comes to you, they're in emotional pain. We don't want to just sit there and watch them be in that pain. And so we want to do whatever we can to take them out of it. Because their emotional pain causes us emotional pain. And let's be honest, emotions hurt. And many of us avoid emotions too. And so it makes more sense to just make sure that all of us are out of that pain pit. Maybe we don't know what to say, and you don't want to make the pain worse. So it's easier to try and reassure or convince otherwise, rather than having them go into the pain deeper and not knowing what to say. Maybe we don't agree or understand the pain. Quite often I'll get the response to that question of, Mom, Dad, I'm a loser at school. Nobody likes me. What would you say? Quite often I hear responses as, well, honey, I don't believe that. I think you're great. If my child came home from school and said to me, nobody likes me, I feel like a loser, I would be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Okay, well, first of all, I teach this enough that I would respond differently. But my initial gut instincts are, you're the coolest kid I know. I don't think you're a loser at all. Like, don't even worry about those kids. They're just being ridiculous. They don't know you well enough. That would be my initial instinct because I don't agree with it. Maybe you weren't taught how to respond to emotional pain, such as vulnerability and anger. And if I wasn't teaching this stuff, I wouldn't know the answer otherwise either. And so hearing your loved ones say these things, it makes you want to just yank them out of it because you were never taught how to respond differently. We're going to talk about that. There are a lot of different reasons how we came to be avoidant of our loved one's emotional pain. And although it makes sense, it's not helpful to stay there, especially if our loved one if our loved one's struggling with symptoms or emotion avoidance, we want to help increase their self-efficacy. So I'm just going to briefly go through some of the reasons why we became a bit of an emotion avoidant culture and then move on from there. So, it's really important to note, I use the historical events idea just like the world wars. So when we are in the world wars, all the young able-bodied men went off to war. Were the people who were left at home encouraged to be sad and grieve and be angry at the government? Or were they encouraged to have a stiff upper lip and support the war effort? Yeah, to support the war effort. And so what happened was that they had to disconnect, almost like neck down, from what was being experienced in their bodies, because otherwise they would be connected to fear around losing their loved one or possible absolute grief and pain from having lost their loved one. And then similarly, the war ended. For the families who lost loved ones, they maybe were rewarded with medals for their loved ones. But again, it was all in service to the country and being proud of having someone who served, or possibly there was even shame around having someone who didn't serve in the way that was expected. So then it was very hush hush. If you ever grew up in a family with someone who had served, did people talk about it openly or not? I know I, as a child, would sometimes ask my grandpa, like, Grandpa, did you shoot people? And everybody would get a bit awkward and say, don't ask those questions. Or, if there are PTSD symptoms that are happening, and then all of a sudden it's like, hey, you just don't talk about certain things, you disconnect from that. And so the history can go back way beyond that. There is research about emotional avoidance being connected to even the French Revolution, but just to bring it more close to home to see how it actually trickles down into the family. I'm sure many of you have known people who have been involved in the World War, or have known of people. And so it would make sense, seeing those dynamics, how people kind of shut off from emotions. And that's a way that we tolerate distress. Distress tolerance actually calls us to kind of like go into fight or flight mode. But what happens is that distress was over. The fire wasn't going off anymore, but the alarm was still sounding. And so people were still disconnected from emotions. And what likely happens is that it then trickles down intergenerationally. So think about how you experienced sadness growing up, how sadness was shown in your home, how your parents showed it, how your siblings showed it, how people around you showed it. Think of how you showed it and how it was responded to. And then similarly, think of anger. How was it expressed? How did you experience it? How did you express it? How were you reacted to? And now think about your own relationship with your loved one who you're supporting. How do you experience it when they express sadness or anger? And does this at all connect to beliefs or reactions that you developed? Sometimes what happens is, if you possibly experienced a lot of anger growing up, you might have made a vow that you would never be loud or yell or angry in your own home, but it's almost to the point of distraction and like walking on eggshells and total disconnection. And so it's interesting how sometimes we can vow to be completely opposite from how it was growing up, but then the pendulum actually swings. So just curious right now, how do you show anger and sadness right now? Who do you allow to see your authentic experience? Do you feel like you have permission to be authentic? And what's it like when your loved one shows it? And how do you feel inside when they start to express anger and sadness, if they do express it? Now, the next one I want to talk about is how avoidance coping is encouraged or even celebrated by the media. We live in an emotion avoidant culture, and there are so many messages out there about having no worries, having no bad days, not crying, having more muscles needed to frown than to smile. And so it really encourages people to just kind of like push forward and go on and be happy. And yet happy is one of many core emotions. Joy is one of many core emotions, and more of them are negative than positive. And so we live in a society that's expecting us to have a smile on all the time. And yet physiologically in our body, it would make sense to have more negative experiences emotionally than positive. Although, of course, we're aiming to have a lot of joy in our world. Sadness, anger, shame, these are not necessarily the most joyful emotions, and yet they're not necessarily acknowledged or encouraged by our society to be felt, but they're totally normal. Emotions are fundamentally adaptive, though. And so, even though they're not necessarily acknowledged or supported in our society, especially when it comes to the more painful ones, they're so normal. And they aid in our survival because they're an alarm system that literally provides information to ourselves and to the world. They give data on how to respond and what's going on based on our body reacting, sometimes before we even form thought. And so they help us survive because they give us really efficient, automatic ways of responding rapidly to important situations. So is anyone here thirsty? I am, so I'm going to take a drink. But the reason why I asked you that wasn't because I was wondering if you were hydrated enough or not, although great if you need to hydrate, but was because thirst presents itself very similarly to emotions physiologically in the body. And if you haven't seen this video, it's a really great one, Inside Out. I think you can see it on Netflix. I recommend going and watching it even with your loved one. But just important to be aware that emotions, much like thirst, present themselves in the body in terms of how they show up physically, the label, the need, and the action tendency. So if you think about thirst, we know we're thirsty because we have a dry mouth. The label is thirst. The need is to get a drink of water or hydrate. The action tendency, which is the action that you take to actually go and get the need met, is to go and find a drink. Similarly for emotions, sadness, anger, shame, joy even, all of the emotions have a label, have a bodily felt sense, have a need, and an action tendency. And so if we actually learn how to listen to the emotion in our body, it can prepare us for action. And it can reduce stress on the body by bringing the system back to baseline. Because remember I said in the last video that if you're constantly ignoring the cues from the body, you're sweeping it under the rug, but you're not making it go away. You're just making it go deeper into the body, which actually increases the stress on the nervous system. So just really quickly here, don't worry too much about remembering it. I just want to show you that physiologically, our body tells us when we have certain emotions. We could do this for all of the emotions, that each emotions have needs. And I will go through those with you actually in video number 3, more specifically on how to meet those emotional needs. And then each emotion also has an action tendency, which is the way that we go and get that need met. So emotion coaching, why do we do this? So short term, imagine that emotion is like an elevator and the door to reason is on the ground floor. If you're on the 2nd floor, the 4th floor, the 10th floor, no matter how much reasoning you're doing with that individual, they're not going to be able to hear where you're coming from fully because they're not going to be on the ground floor. And so if you're able to emotion coach, what you do is you literally bring the body down to baseline. You help calm the emotion mind in the body. You help bring the elevator down to the ground floor, and then the doors can open and you can actually step in. Short term, if you emotion coach your loved one, you can actually avoid escalation. You can de-escalate situations that are already really activated. You can also improve compliance in your loved one, especially if you're supporting symptoms and behavioral change, because you're going to help them better regulate, which means that when you go to that more reasonable place, they're going to better be able to hear you and work from there. Just a little tiny sophisticated piece of evidence. Never in the history of calming down has anyone ever calmed down by being told to calm down. And yet how many of us do this, myself included, because you're not perfect all the time, not even a little bit. And so it can be so tempting when our loved ones are emotionally activated and blowing their lids to tell them to calm down. Yet what happens is this usually increases the emotion or it buries it underground. So maybe they stop being explosive, but it actually just goes inside and doesn't actually get the emotion out in a healthy way, or it blows their lid and makes everything feel even bigger. So that goes in the pile with, you must be tired, hungry, or it must be that time of the month. All major no-nos. And I can tell you that from when my daughter could just barely talk, I would say to her, if she's freaking out, like, oh, you're tired, knowing very well that she was tired, but she'd say, no bed. And so like, it's normal to want to resist some of the things that maybe are very obvious, but if an emotion is there, it's about more than just the fact if someone's tired or hungry. Sure, that might be making it bigger. But if the emotion comes up, it was in the body for a reason. And so it's helpful to just kind of go there. And at the end of the day, even if it is more connected to the fact that the individual is tired or hungry, I can promise you that you're going to help them better be able to calm by connecting to what's coming up immediately in front of you rather than pulling at it's that time of the month or you're tired or you're hungry. Even as convincing as that may feel, like you want to go there. Instead, we're going to try not to, and we're going to work on that a little bit in this video as well as the next video. Long term, why do I want to have everybody in the world emotion coach all of those around them? Well, specifically for your loved one who you're supporting, is that they'll actually feel like you get it and that they're not alone to face life's challenges. And so there's actually a step of emotion coaching called validation that I'll go over in video 3. And it helps you put yourself in your loved one's shoes, and it helps them feel like you're getting it from their perspective, even if you don't really get it from their perspective. By helping put words to it, it helps them learn that emotional challenges are part of life and can be dealt with because you can be present with them in it instead of doing the opposite, which is helping to shut it down or be avoidant. You're going to invite them to enter into it and help them navigate it. And they will eventually internalize the ability to regulate and problem solve instead of using symptoms, peer orientation, or unhealthy relationships to cope. So in the long term, we want to help our loved ones be able to internalize that blueprint for how to navigate emotions on their own so that when they do have to deal with tricky situations, they'll know that they can handle it because their self-efficacy has increased. So contrary to many of the fears that I quite often hear about, well, won't giving emotional support make my child then always need emotional support from me? It's actually the opposite. By emotion coaching them and helping them to learn how to label and make sense of their emotions and their experiences, you're going to be internalizing a blueprint for them so that they're going to better be able to do that for themselves and launch rather than having to use avoidant numbness to cope with what's going on and never learning the words. So this is the goal. Your loved one has a painful experience. They receive an attuned response from the environment, from you, from those around them, but we can only control ourselves, so specifically from you when possible, by having an attuned response from the environment. So instead of when the child comes home and says, I feel like a loser, no one likes me, and saying, don't worry, saying like, oh my gosh, that's really hard. You know, it must make you feel really, really mad and kind of embarrassed about the fact that everyone's avoiding you and not talking to you, and it might make you wonder, like, what's wrong with me? And we'll talk more about validation next week because it can be a bit vocative. But essentially, you're connecting to what's going on. This can actually increase feelings of confidence about the emotions in tricky situations, believe it or not, even though that fear might be there around making it worse. Helping put labels and helping even just put words to the situation can help the loved one feel like they're not alone in it and like you're not afraid of it, so they can actually settle more into it. And when individuals learn how to put words to their situations, connect to the environment around them, have support, they're not going to need those maladaptive coping behaviors, strategies, or relationships in the same way, because they won't be trying to run away from their emotions constantly or trying to numb out from their emotions constantly. So just briefly, what is validation and what is it not? So before we talk specifically about what validation is, I just want to talk about what validation isn't, because it can be so tempting to fall into some of these traps of believing that we are actually validating when we're not actually validating. We're doing something completely different. So I'm going to say a statement, and then I'm going to help you to understand how to respond to me in these different ways that aren't validation. So the first response is invalidation, which just be no, you're not, or no, it's not, and then saying something negative about the person. So if your loved one were to say to you, this is hard, invalidate negative would look like, no, it's not, you just need to try harder. Or no, it's not, like you're just stupid. Or no, it's not, you're not putting in enough effort. This answer is the answer that we give when we've had a really long day, we're exhausted, we got bad news at work, the cat peed on the carpet, and the flight to Mexico was canceled. It's like disagreement, just get over it, hurry up, come on. That's not validation, you guessed it. Next one actually is a lot more of the norm in our society, but it's also not validation. So let's see if you can guess this one. So what you're going to do after I say a statement is you're going to say, no, it's not. Then you're going to say something positive about me in the situation. This is hard. No, it's not. You can do it. So this is the cheerleader response. You know, someone says, I can't do this. And instead of being like, oh, that's so frustrating, you're like, you can totally do it. It's not hard. You've got this. So you're really trying to pep and cheerlead that person to help them do it. And yet it's totally ignoring the fact that they just said, like, I'm struggling with this. This is so hard. The next one is reassurance. And so this is also something that we jump to, and is not validation. So this is hard. Would be like, I know you can do it. I'm going to be here with you. You got to put in a little more effort. You're going to be able to do this. You're going to overcome it. You've got this. So it's like becoming that somewhat like cheerleader coach. And yet it's also not acknowledging the statement which said, this is hard. The next one is problem solving. So if your loved one says to you, this is hard, it's like, okay, well, maybe we just need to, get the tutor, and then the tutor can help you with it. And we'll look through the math book and let me see if I can help understand it. Again, jumping to kind of fixing it, which has its place. And I'll talk next video about how reassurance and problem solving absolutely has its place, but it's not number one on the hierarchy of responding to someone's emotional expression or just expression of what's going on. So think about what your typical go-to is. We usually have go-tos. I know for myself, before I learned a lot about emotion coaching and practiced it consistently to get it into like a new neural pathway in my brain, so I didn't have the norm of this, I was definitely a cheerleader and a problem solver. I'd be like, oh, no, you can do it. Come on. And I'd be like, I'm going to sit down and help you figure it out. Totally disconnecting, absolutely problem solving, help me feel better, help me feel like I was moving the person through the situation. And again, reassurance and problem solving aren't bad, but they don't come first in the hierarchy of connecting to your loved one's struggle. So I can't actually show you this video, but I want to tell you about it and encourage you to go and watch it after you watch this video with me. So if you just go to YouTube and type in Phil Dunn Empathy Modern Family, if you haven't seen Modern Family, I think it's pretty hilarious. But this specific clip just goes through empathy a la Phil Dunphy. And it's a cute little clip, and it's just really reflective on how we can be and how we can be different. So next video, I'm going to talk to you about the specifics of emotion coaching. So today I talked about what validation isn't, but in the next video, I'm going to talk about what validation is, as well as how you can offer emotional support to your loved one and practical support. So you can absolutely bring in some of that problem solving if needed. Although it's interesting how it isn't actually needed as much as we think it is, if we can truly harness the healing power and transformative power of connecting to our loved ones' emotions. The homework from this video is the relationship dimensions. So I mentioned printing them off earlier and rating yourself where you are. Now, another way that you can use the relationship dimensions is that you can print them off and give a blank copy to your loved one and ask them to mark off where you are. You can be really curious to look at their responses of where you are in the dynamic extremes and your responses and see if they match. You can also ask them, if you feel brave, to grab a different color pen and mark off where your partner is or where their your co-parent is, if there are two of you caregiving or different caregivers, just to see like the opposites of what's experienced by the individual. Now, based off of what they've said your extremes are and looking at what you've identified your extremes are, I would say pick one of those extremes and then try and do the opposite for a day. So if it's never setting limits, try and think of a small limit that you can set. Or if you don't have humor in the home anymore and you miss it, try thinking of something that you can do. We had a mom one time who made spaghetti for dinner and had a spaghetti noodle hanging out of her mouth the entire dinner, and people tried to tell her and she just was like, what's wrong? And then they all ended up having a laugh. Another mom who, when they were all together, just burst into song and then acted like nothing had happened. And so if you haven't had play or humor, think about how you can bring that more into your world. Or if you're always apologizing, think of how you could stop for the day and just notice what happens. So I encourage you to think of one of the extremes and try to set a goal around the other extreme to notice what happens inside of you and just to notice if anything shifts in your relationship. It doesn't mean that it's going to fix anything overnight, but remember, it's a process of one brick at a time. And so if we can change the dynamics of how we're relating to our loved ones, then they are going to eventually fall into suit. And then as you start to learn more of the emotion coaching skills, which I'll teach in the next video, you'll be able to pull those in as well as you make some of these changes. Not easy, worth it. You can absolutely do it. So I want to thank you for joining me for this video. Take some time before you dive into the next video, because I would love for this stuff to integrate a little bit. And then I'll look forward to seeing you in video number 3.